The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty trading post that sat like a lonely sentinel in the vast desert landscape. It was the summer of 1878, and the heat shimmered off the red earth in waves that made the distant mountains dance like mirages. The wooden structure, weathered gray by countless sandstorms and blazing summers, creaked under the weight of its own desperation. Inside the dimly lit establishment, the air hung thick with the smell of whiskey, tobacco, and human misery. Jeremiah Blackwood, a trader whose reputation for cruelty had spread across 3 territories, sat hunched over a bottle of rot-gut whiskey at a table made from rough-hewn planks. His bloodshot eyes surveyed his latest acquisition with the cold calculation of a man who had long since traded his soul for profit. Ayanna, whose name meant eternal blossom in the Apache tongue, sat bound in the corner of the room. Her dark eyes held a fierce dignity that even captivity could not extinguish. She was perhaps 19 years old, with the graceful bearing of her people and skin bronzed by the desert sun. Her long black hair, once adorned with traditional beads and feathers, now hung loose around her shoulders, but her spirit remained unbroken despite the circumstances that had brought her to this wretched place. 3 days earlier, Blackwood had acquired Ayanna from a band of Mexican slavers who had raided her village while the Apache warriors were away hunting. The transaction had been swift and brutal, conducted in the harsh light of dawn, with the girl's terrified cries echoing across the desert. Now, as he took another swig of whiskey, Blackwood contemplated the profit he would make from selling her to the highest bidder. The trading post served as a crossroads for the desperate and the opportunistic, prospectors seeking their fortunes, cattle drivers pushing herds across the unforgiving landscape, and men running from their pasts all passed through its doors. But it was also a place where human lives were bought and sold like cattle, where the weak were preyed upon by those who had abandoned any pretense of civilized behavior. Ayanna's thoughts drifted to her village, hidden in the red cliffs of the Chiricahua Mountains. She remembered the sound of her grandmother's voice, teaching her the old songs, the smell of sage burning in the ceremonial fires, and the laughter of children playing in the shade of the cottonwood trees. Her people had lived in harmony with the harsh desert for generations, reading the signs in the wind and the stars, finding water where others saw only death. Her father, Nalnish, was a respected warrior and storyteller who had taught her the ways of their people. He had been away with a hunting party when the slavers struck, and Ayanna could only imagine his rage and sorrow when he returned to find his daughter gone. The Apache were fierce fighters, but they were also pragmatic. They would not risk the lives of the entire village to rescue one person, even one as beloved as Ayanna. Blackwood's gravelly voice cut through her reverie. "You're a pretty little thing, ain't you?" he slurred, his words thick with alcohol. "Gonna fetch me a fine price, you are. Got a buyer coming in from El Paso? Heard he's got a special taste for your kind." Ayanna did not respond, but her eyes flashed with defiance. She had learned enough English from the few white traders who had dealt honestly with her people to understand his words, but she would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. Among the Apache, courage in the face of adversity was prized above all else, and she would not dishonor her ancestors by showing weakness. The trading post's door creaked open, and a figure appeared silhouetted against the blazing afternoon sun. As the newcomer stepped inside, the floorboards groaned under his weight. He was a tall man, perhaps 35 years old, with the weathered features of someone who had spent his life under the open sky. His clothes were dusty from travel, and his broad-brimmed hat cast shadows across his face. Thomas McKenna removed his hat and hung it on a peg near the door, revealing sandy brown hair and eyes the color of storm clouds. He owned a small ranch about 60 miles to the north, where he raised cattle and horses with a small crew of trusted hands. McKenna had a reputation as a fair man who treated his workers well and kept his word, qualities that were increasingly rare in the lawless territories. "Blackwood," McKenna said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I've ridden 3 days to get here. Heard you might have something I'm interested in." Blackwood looked up from his bottle, his eyes narrowing with suspicion and greed. "Well, well, McKenna, what brings the high and mighty rancher to my humble establishment? Not often we see your kind in these parts." McKenna's gaze swept the room, taking in the squalid conditions and the bound girl in the corner. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady. "I'm looking to buy the Apache girl. Name your price." Ayana's head snapped up at his words, her dark eyes studying this new player in her uncertain fate. She had heard of McKenna from some of the Apache scouts who had observed his ranch from the surrounding hills. Unlike many white settlers, he had never made war on her people, and there were even stories of him providing water and supplies to Apache families during the harsh winter months. Blackwood's laugh was harsh and grating. "Straight to business, eh? I like that, but this little flower here ain't cheap. She's prime goods, untouched and spirited. Got a buyer coming from El Paso who's offered me $800 for her." McKenna's expression remained impassive, but those who knew him well would have recognized the dangerous glint in his eyes. $800 is a lot of money for a man in your position, Blackwood, especially considering the territorial marshal has been asking questions about your business practices. The trader's face darkened. "You threatening me, McKenna? I run a legitimate business here, and I got papers for the girl. Bought her fair and square from some Mexican traders." "Papers can be forged," McKenna replied calmly. "And Mexican slavers aren't exactly known for their attention to legal niceties. But I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to make a deal. $1,000 cash money right now." Ayana watched this exchange with growing fascination. She could sense the tension between the two men, the subtle dance of power and negotiation that would determine her fate. McKenna's offer was generous, more than fair by any standard, but she wondered what motivated his interest in her freedom. Blackwood's eyes gleamed with avarice. $1,000 was more money than he had seen in months, and it would allow him to stock his trading post with supplies and whiskey for the coming winter. But there was something about McKenna's demeanor that made him hesitate. The rancher was too calm, too confident, as if he held cards that Blackwood couldn't see. "You seem mighty interested in one Apache girl," Blackwood said, trying to regain some advantage in the negotiation. "What's your game, McKenna? Planning to start your own little harem out there on your ranch?" McKenna's voice turned cold as winter wind. "My reasons are my own, Blackwood. Do we have a deal or not?" The trader drained his bottle and slammed it down on the table. The sound echoed through the cramped room like a gunshot. "All right, McKenna, $1,000 and she's yours. But the money first, then the girl." McKenna reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch heavy with gold coins. The sound of metal clinking against metal filled the air as he counted out the agreed-upon sum. Each coin represented hours of hard work, cattle sold at market, and careful saving. It was a fortune by frontier standards, enough to buy a small spread complete with livestock and equipment. As the transaction proceeded, Ayana felt a mixture of emotions coursing through her. Fear of the unknown warred with hope for a better fate than what awaited her with Blackwood's mysterious buyer from El Paso. She had heard whispers of what happened to Apache women who disappeared into the slave trade, stories that made her blood run cold. McKenna completed the count and pushed the coins across the table. "There's your $1,000, Blackwood. Now cut her loose." Blackwood's hands shook slightly as he gathered the gold, his greed overcoming his usual caution. "Pleasure doing business with you, McKenna, but don't come crying to me if she tries to scalp you in your sleep. These Apache women are wild as mountain cats." "I'll take my chances," McKenna replied, drawing a knife from his belt. He approached Ayana carefully, his movements slow and non-threatening. "I'm going to cut those ropes," he said in halting but recognizable Apache, surprising her with his knowledge of her language. "I mean you no harm." Ayana's eyes widened at his words. Few white men bothered to learn the Apache tongue, and even fewer spoke it with the respect that McKenna showed. As the ropes fell away from her wrists and ankles, she felt the blood rushing back into her extremities. She rubbed her wrists where the rough hemp had chafed her skin, but she did not move from her position. "Can you ride?" McKenna asked, still speaking in her native language. "Yes," Ayana replied, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the first word she had spoken in days. "Good. My horse is outside. We have a long journey ahead of us." Blackwood watched this exchange with growing unease. Something about McKenna's behavior struck him as odd, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. The rancher was treating the Apache girl with a respect that seemed out of place in a slave transaction. "Hey, McKenna," Blackwood called out as the rancher prepared to leave. "You sure you know what you're doing? That girl's got murder in her eyes. Apache women are known for their treachery." McKenna turned back, his expression cold and hard. "The only treachery I see here is a man who profits from human misery. You do well to remember that the world is changing, Blackwood. The old ways of doing business won't last forever." Outside, the desert heat hit them like a physical blow. McKenna's horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Thunder, stood patiently in the shade of the trading post's narrow porch. The animal was trail-hardened and reliable, with the kind of endurance necessary for long journeys across unforgiving terrain. As they prepared to leave, Ayana caught sight of something that made her heart race. In the distance, barely visible through the heat shimmer, she could make out the figures of 3 riders approaching the trading post. Even at this distance, she could tell by their riding style and the way they sat their horses that they were Apache. Her pulse quickened as she recognized the lead rider. It was her brother, Geronimo, whose name meant "one who yawns," but whose reputation as a fierce warrior was known throughout the territory. He had been named for the great Apache leader, and like his namesake, he possessed a cunning intelligence and an unwavering determination to protect his people. Geronimo had clearly tracked her here, following the trail left by Blackwood and the Mexican slavers. The fact that he had only brought 2 other warriors with him spoke to the desperate nature of their mission. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they had come anyway, driven by the bonds of family and the Apache code of honor. McKenna noticed her sudden tension and followed her gaze to the approaching riders. His expression remained calm, but his hand moved instinctively to the Colt 45 at his hip. "Friends of yours?" he asked in Apache. "My brother," Ayana replied, her voice tight with emotion. "He has come for me." The situation was about to become significantly more complicated. McKenna had just spent $1,000 to purchase Ayana's freedom, but her brother and his companions would have no way of knowing his intentions. To them, he would appear to be just another white man who had bought their sister as property. "Listen to me carefully," McKenna said, his voice urgent but calm. "I know your brother's reputation. He's a warrior of great skill and fierce loyalty, but if he attacks now, people will die unnecessarily. Can you trust me long enough to explain the situation to him?" Ayana studied McKenna's face, searching for any sign of deception. What she saw there surprised her. Despite the danger of the approaching warriors, his primary concern seemed to be preventing bloodshed, not protecting his own investment. There was something in his eyes, a pain that she recognized because she had seen it in her own reflection during the long nights of captivity. "I will trust you," she said finally, "but my brother will not be easily convinced. He has seen too much suffering at the hands of white men to believe in good intentions." The 3 Apache warriors drew closer, their horses raising small clouds of dust as they approached the trading post. Geronimo rode in the lead, his lean frame tense with barely controlled fury. He was slightly older than Ayana, with the same dark eyes and proud bearing, but his face was marked by the harsh realities of warfare and loss. Behind him rode 2 younger warriors, Naiche and Chihuahua, both skilled fighters who had volunteered for this dangerous mission. They were armed with rifles and traditional weapons, ready to fight to the death if necessary to rescue their sister and friend. McKenna stepped forward, placing himself between Ayana and the trading post. It was a gesture that could be interpreted as protective, but it also put him in a vulnerable position if the warriors chose to attack. He raised his hands slowly, palms open, in the universal sign of peaceful intentions. "I come in peace," he called out in Apache, his voice carrying clearly across the desert air. "I seek to return your sister to her people." Geronimo brought his horse to a stop about 30 yards away, close enough to talk, but far enough to react if this was a trap. His dark eyes swept over the scene, taking in McKenna's defensive posture, Ayana's unbound state, and the lack of other armed men in the vicinity. "You speak our language, white man," Geronimo said, his voice carrying the authority of a natural leader. "But words are like wind in the desert. They can shift direction without warning. Why should I believe you seek to help my sister?" McKenna kept his hands visible and his voice steady. "Because I have already paid the trader for her freedom. $1,000 in gold. She is no longer his property, and I have no intention of making her mine." This declaration caused a stir among the three warriors. $1,000 was an enormous sum, more than most settlers saw in a year. The fact that McKenna had paid it willingly suggested either great wealth or powerful motivation. Geronimo's eyes narrowed as he tried to understand the rancher's true intentions. "If you have truly freed her," Geronimo said, "then why do you not simply let her go? Why do you stand between her and her people?" It was a fair question, and one that McKenna had been dreading. The truth was complicated, and he wasn't sure how to explain it without revealing too much about his own troubled past. But he had committed to this course of action, and he would see it through regardless of the personal cost. "Because," McKenna said carefully, "her freedom is not as simple as cutting ropes. The trader has already sent word to his contacts about her sale. There are men coming who will not accept that she is no longer available. They will pursue her, and they will bring violence to any who stand in their way." Ayana listened to this exchange with growing understanding. McKenna was right about the dangers she would face if she simply returned to her people. The slave trade was a ruthless business, and those involved in it did not easily accept financial losses. Her presence among the Apache would bring danger to the entire village. "Then what do you propose?" Geronimo asked, his tone still skeptical but less hostile than before. McKenna took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would determine whether this situation ended in bloodshed or understanding. "I propose that your sister comes with me to my ranch, where she will be safe and protected until the immediate danger passes. When it is safe for her to return to her people, I will provide her with supplies and an escort to ensure her safe passage." The silence that followed this proposal was deafening. The three Apache warriors exchanged glances, communicating through subtle signs and expressions that spoke of years of fighting together. Ayana watched her brother's face, seeing the internal struggle between his desire to take her home immediately and his recognition of the logic in McKenna's words. "And what guarantee do we have?" Geronimo asked finally. "That you will not simply keep her as your own? White men have broken many promises to the Apache." McKenna's jaw tightened, and for a moment, his carefully controlled facade cracked slightly. "You have my word," he said, his voice carrying a weight of conviction that surprised even him. "I know that means little coming from a white man, but it is all I can offer. Your sister will be treated with respect and dignity, and she will be free to leave whenever she chooses." Ayana stepped forward, her decision made. "Brother," she said, her voice clear and strong, "I have watched this man, and I have listened to his words. There is pain in his eyes, the kind that comes from great loss. I believe he speaks the truth about the dangers that await, and I believe he will honor his promise." Geronimo's expression softened slightly as he looked at his sister. Despite her youth, Ayana had always possessed a wisdom beyond her years and an intuitive understanding of human nature. If she believed McKenna could be trusted, then perhaps there was more to this white rancher than met the eye. "Very well," Geronimo said finally. "But know this, McKenna, if any harm comes to my sister, if she is mistreated in any way, I will hunt you across every territory until I find you. And when I do, your death will be neither quick nor easy." McKenna nodded gravely. "I would expect nothing less from a brother who loves his sister. You have my word that she will be safe, The tension in the air began to ease slightly, but the situation was far from resolved. As if summoned by the drama unfolding before the trading post, a dust cloud appeared on the southern horizon. Even at this distance, it was clear that a large group of riders was approaching, and they were coming fast. Blackwood emerged from the trading post, his face flushed with alcohol and anxiety. "That'll be my buyer from El Paso," he said, his voice slurred but tinged with worry. "He ain't gonna be happy about this development." McKenna's expression hardened. "How many men?" "Dozen, maybe more," Blackwood replied. "Rodriguez doesn't travel light, and he doesn't take kindly to being crossed." The approaching riders were still several miles away, but McKenna could already see that this was not going to be a simple business transaction. Rodriguez was known throughout the territory as a ruthless slave trader who used violence and intimidation to maintain his operation. The fact that he was traveling with such a large force suggested that he was prepared for trouble. "We need to leave," McKenna said, turning to Ayanna and her brother. "Now." Geronimo nodded, his warrior instincts taking over. "We will escort you for the first day's ride," he said. "After that, you will be on your own." As they prepared to depart, Ayanna took one last look at the trading post that had been her prison for the past 3 days. The sun was beginning to set, painting the desert in shades of red and gold, and she could feel the cool evening breeze starting to stir. Soon, the brutal heat would give way to the desert's equally harsh cold, and travelers would need to find shelter or risk death from exposure. McKenna helped her mount behind him on Thunder, and she wrapped her arms around his waist for stability. The contact felt strange and intimate, but she sensed no impropriety in his manner. He was treating her with the same respect he would show any traveling companion, and she found herself cautiously optimistic about what lay ahead. The small group set out across the desert, 6 people bound together by circumstance and necessity. Behind them, the dust cloud of Rodriguez's approaching force grew larger and more ominous. Ahead lay the unknown dangers of the trail and the uncertainty of what would happen when they reached McKenna's ranch. As they rode, Ayanna found herself studying the man who had purchased her freedom. There was something about McKenna that set him apart from the other white men she had encountered. He rode with the easy confidence of someone who belonged in this harsh landscape, and his knowledge of Apache customs and language suggested a deeper understanding of her people than most settlers possessed. The desert around them was beginning to come alive with the sounds of evening. Coyotes called to each other across the scrubland, and the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and Ayanna was grateful for the warmth of the horse beneath her and the windbreak provided by McKenna's broad shoulders. As they rode through the night, each of them lost in their own thoughts about the uncertain future that lay ahead. None of them could have imagined the trials and revelations that would test their resolve in the days to come. The desert had claimed many travelers over the years, and it would demand its price from them as well before their journey was complete. But for now, they rode together through the darkness, bound by a fragile trust and a shared determination to survive whatever challenges awaited them in the unforgiving wilderness of the American Southwest. The first rays of dawn painted the desert landscape in shades of amber and crimson as the small group of riders crested a low ridge 20 miles north of the trading post. They had ridden through the night, pushing their horses to the limit while navigating by starlight and the ancient Apache knowledge that Geronimo carried in his blood. The animals were showing signs of fatigue, their breathing labored and their steps less sure than when they had begun their desperate flight. McKenna called for a halt in the shadow of a massive sandstone outcropping that would provide both shelter and a vantage point from which to observe their back trail. The formation rose from the desert floor like a natural fortress, its weathered walls carved by centuries of wind and rain into fantastic shapes that seemed to shift and change in the uncertain light of dawn. Ayanna slid down from Thunder's back, her legs trembling slightly from the long ride. She had never traveled such a distance on horseback in a single night, and her muscles ached from maintaining her grip on the animal's flanks. Despite her discomfort, she felt a surge of gratitude for the freedom to move and stretch after the days of confinement at the trading post. Geronimo dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who had learned to ride before he could walk properly. His dark eyes swept the horizon behind them, searching for any sign of pursuit. The desert stretched out in all directions, a vast expanse of scrubland dotted with saguaro cacti and ocotillo that stood like sentinels against the lightening sky. "We should rest the horses," McKenna said, his voice hoarse from the night's exertion. "But not for long. Rodriguez will be following our trail, and he has fresh mounts." Naiche, the younger of Geronimo's two companions, scrambled up the rocky outcropping with the agility of a mountain goat. From his elevated position, he could see for miles in every direction, and his trained warrior's eye would catch any movement that might indicate approaching danger. "How do you know so much about this Rodriguez?" Geronimo asked, his tone carrying a note of suspicion that had not been present the night before. McKenna's jaw tightened, and for a moment he seemed to be debating how much to reveal. "Because I've had dealings with him before," he said finally. 3 years ago, he tried to buy Apache children from a band of Comancheros who had raided a village near my ranch. I intervened, and he hasn't forgotten the financial loss I caused him. Ayana studied McKenna's face as he spoke, noting the way his eyes hardened at the memory. There was more to the story than he was telling, she realized, but she could sense the genuine anger and disgust in his voice when he spoke of the slave trade. "You cost him money," Geronimo observed. "That makes this personal for him." "Very personal," McKenna agreed. "Rodriguez doesn't just see Ayana as lost property, he sees her as a way to settle an old score with me. When he discovers that I'm the one who bought her from Blackwood, he'll pursue us with everything he has." The implications of this revelation settled over the group like a dark cloud. What had begun as a rescue mission had now become something far more complex and dangerous. Rodriguez would not simply give up and return to El Paso empty-handed. He would follow them across the territory if necessary, driven by both greed and the desire for revenge. Chihuahua, the third Apache warrior, had been maintaining a careful watch on their back trail. Now, he raised his hand in a gesture that immediately caught everyone's attention. In the distance, barely visible through the morning haze, a line of riders had appeared on the horizon. They were still several miles away, but their purposeful movement left no doubt about their intentions. 12 riders, Chihuahua reported, his voice calm despite the gravity of the situation. "They are following our trail." McKenna checked his pocket watch, a gift from his late father that had survived years of frontier life. 7 hours, he said grimly. "They made better time than I expected." The slave traders' force was larger and better mounted than McKenna had hoped, but it was about what he had feared. Rodriguez was known for his thoroughness and his willingness to use overwhelming force to achieve his objectives. The fact that he had brought so many men suggested that he was prepared for a protracted chase. "We need to move," Geronimo said, his warrior instincts taking over. "The horses cannot maintain yesterday's pace, but we must put distance between ourselves and our pursuers." As they prepared to resume their journey, Ayana approached McKenna with a question that had been troubling her since their conversation at the trading post. "You said that men would come for me even if I returned to my people. But now I understand that this Rodriguez pursues us because of you, not because of me. Would my village be safe if I simply disappeared into the desert?" McKenna's expression grew troubled. "It's not that simple," he said. "Rodriguez has contacts throughout the territory. He knows where the Apache villages are located, and he wouldn't hesitate to take hostages or burn crops to force your people to surrender you. Your presence among them would make the entire village a target." The brutal logic of the situation was not lost on Ayana. The slave trade was a cancer that infected everything it touched, turning neighbors against each other and making innocents into victims. Her freedom had been purchased at the cost of safety for everyone around her. "Then we run," she said simply. For as long as necessary, we run. McKenna agreed. But we run smart. This is your country, not Rodriguez's. If we can reach the mountains, we'll have advantages that numbers can't overcome. Geronimo nodded approvingly. The Chiricahua Mountains are 2 days' ride to the north. There are canyons and passes that would be difficult for a large force to navigate, but we will need to lose some of them along the way. The group remounted and resumed their journey, but the pace was necessarily slower than it had been during the night. The horses were tired, and the desert was beginning to heat up as the sun climbed higher in the sky. By midday, the temperature would be unbearable for both man and beast. As they rode, McKenna found himself studying the landscape with new eyes. He had traveled this country many times over the years, but always as a businessman or rancher going about his normal activities. Now he was seeing it as a fugitive, looking for places to hide, water sources to sustain them, and terrain features that might provide tactical advantages. The desert was deceptive in its apparent emptiness. What looked like barren wasteland to the untrained eye was actually a complex ecosystem filled with life and resources for those who knew how to find them. The Apache had survived in this harsh environment for generations, learning to read the subtle signs that indicated water, shelter, and danger. Ayana rode behind McKenna, her arms wrapped around his waist for stability. The physical contact had become less awkward as the hours passed, and she found herself oddly comforted by his steady presence. There was something about the way he sat his horse and scanned the horizon that reminded her of her father and the other Apache warriors she had known. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, speaking softly so that her voice would not carry to the others. McKenna was quiet for a moment, as if considering how much to share. "It's a small operation," he said finally. "About 3,000 acres in a valley between 2 mountain ranges. Good grass, reliable water, and enough timber to build what we need. I run cattle and horses, mostly for the army posts in the territory. Do you live alone?" "I have a foreman named Samuel Porter and 4 other hands. Good men, all of them. They know the risks of frontier life, and they're prepared to defend the ranch if necessary." Ayana sensed there was more to the story, but she did not press him for details. Everyone who lived on the frontier had losses and tragedies in their past, and she understood the desire to keep some memories private. The sun was approaching its zenith when Naiche, who had been scouting ahead, returned with news that would change their plans. "There is a problem," he reported. "The waterhole at Skull Rock has been poisoned, dead animals around it, and the water smells of death." This was a serious blow to their escape plans. Skull Rock was a well-known landmark and water source that they had been counting on to rest and water their horses. Without it, they would have to push on to the next reliable water, which was still 8 hours away. "Could be accidental," McKenna said, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it. "Or it could be that Rodriguez has friends in this area who are helping him." Geronimo's expression was grim. "The Comancheros sometimes poison water sources to force travelers to use routes they control. If Rodriguez has made deals with them, our situation is worse than we thought." The Comancheros were a loose confederation of traders and outlaws who operated throughout the Southwest, dealing in everything from stolen livestock to human beings. They had no loyalty to any government or people, caring only for profit and their own survival. If Rodriguez had enlisted their aid, the fugitives would find themselves facing enemies who knew the country as well as the Apache did. "We need to change our route," McKenna said. "Head more to the west, toward the Dragoon Mountains. It's rougher country, but there are water sources that the Comancheros don't control. That will add a day to our journey," Geronimo pointed out, "and it will take us through territory where the cavalry patrols regularly. We could find ourselves caught between Rodriguez and the army." It was a difficult choice, but McKenna knew they had no alternative. The poisoned waterhole was a clear message that their enemies were ahead of them as well as behind them. They would have to risk the cavalry patrols and the additional time in the open desert. As they changed course toward the west, the group fell into a rhythm that would sustain them through the long hours ahead. The Apache warriors took turns, scouting ahead and behind, their movements so smooth and practiced that they seemed to flow across the landscape like shadows. McKenna maintained a steady pace that would conserve their horses' strength while still making progress toward their destination. The desert around them was beginning to show signs of the approaching summer heat. The saguaro cacti stood like ancient sentinels, their arms raised to the sky in poses that seemed to mock the struggles of the tiny human figures passing below. Lizards scurried across the hot sand, and high overhead, vultures circled patiently on the thermals, waiting for the desert to claim another victim. By late afternoon, the pursuing riders had closed the distance to about 5 miles. They were visible now as individual figures, rather than a distant dust cloud, and their relentless pace suggested that they were riding fresh horses. Rodriguez had clearly prepared for a long chase, bringing spare mounts and supplies to sustain his force. "We're not going to outrun them," McKenna said, voicing what everyone was thinking. "Not on tired horses across open ground." Geronimo studied the terrain ahead, his experienced eye picking out features that might provide tactical advantages. "There," he said, pointing to a series of low mesas that rose from the desert floor like steps leading to the sky. "We can make a stand there if necessary. High ground, good cover, and only a few approaches." "A stand means a fight," McKenna said, "and a fight means people die." "People may die anyway," Geronimo replied. "But if we choose the ground, we choose how many of them die with us." The grim practicality of the Apache warriors' statement was not lost on any of them. They were outnumbered 2 to 1, and their enemies were well armed and motivated by both greed and revenge. If it came to a fight, their chances of survival were slim. But as they approached the mesas, Ayana had an idea that might give them an alternative to a suicidal last stand. "The old stories," she said, her voice carrying a note of excitement. "My grandmother told me of a place near here where the ancestors hid from their enemies. A canyon that appears to be a dead end but has a hidden passage." Geronimo's eyes widened with understanding. "The Canyon of Whispers," he said. "I had forgotten. It is said to be somewhere in this area." "You know it?" McKenna asked. "I know the stories," Geronimo replied, "but I have never seen it myself. The entrance is supposed to be hidden, disguised by the way the light and shadows fall on the rock walls. It was a desperate gamble, but it might be their only chance. If the canyon existed and they could find it, they might be able to lose their pursuers, or at least force them to split up to search multiple routes. If it didn't exist, or if they couldn't find it, they would be trapped in rough country with limited escape routes." As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the small group of fugitives made their way toward the labyrinth of canyons and mesas that might hold their salvation. Behind them, Rodriguez's force continued its relentless pursuit, driven by the promise of profit and the desire for revenge. The temperature was beginning to drop as evening approached, but the rock still radiated heat from the day's brutal sun. The horses were showing signs of serious fatigue now, their heads hanging low and their steps uncertain. They would need rest and water soon, or they would begin to collapse from exhaustion. "There!" Nietzsche called out, pointing to a narrow opening between 2 towering walls of red sandstone. "That could be the entrance." The opening was so narrow that it was barely visible from more than a few hundred yards away, hidden in the shadows cast by the surrounding cliffs. It looked like nothing more than a crack in the rock wall, but as they approached, they could see that it was actually a passageway wide enough for a horse and rider. Geronimo dismounted and examined the ground around the entrance. "No recent tracks," he reported, "but there are old signs, unshod horses, moccasin prints. Apache have used this route before." McKenna felt a surge of hope. If this was indeed the Canyon of Whispers from the old stories, it might provide them with the refuge they desperately needed. But they would have to move quickly. Rodriguez's force was close enough now that they could hear the faint sound of hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls. "We go in," McKenna decided. It's a risk, but staying out here is certain death. One by one, they led their horses into the narrow passage. The walls rose high above them, blocking out most of the remaining daylight and creating a twilight world of shadows and echoes. The passage twisted and turned, sometimes widening into small chambers, sometimes narrowing so much that they had to turn sideways to get through. As they penetrated deeper into the canyon, Ayana began to notice something strange about the acoustics. Every sound seemed to be amplified and distorted, creating an eerie symphony of whispers and echoes that gave the place its name. The effect was unsettling, but it also suggested that the canyon had unique properties that might help conceal their presence. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, they emerged into a hidden valley that took their breath away. The canyon walls opened up to reveal a circular basin about half a mile across, with a small spring bubbling up from the center and cottonwood trees providing shade and shelter. It was like finding an oasis in the middle of hell. "The ancestors' refuge," Geronimo whispered, his voice filled with awe. "It truly exists." But their relief was short-lived. As they watered their horses and took stock of their situation, they realized that they were not the only ones who had discovered this hidden sanctuary. On the far side of the valley, barely visible in the gathering darkness, were the dying embers of a campfire. Someone else was here, and there was no way to know if they were friend or foe. McKenna drew his pistol and motioned for the others to take cover behind the trees. "Stay quiet," he whispered. "Let me check this out." As he moved carefully toward the distant campfire, his mind raced with possibilities. The most likely explanation was that they had stumbled upon a camp of Comancheros or other outlaws who were using the hidden valley as a base of operations. If that was the case, they might have walked into a trap that was even deadlier than the one they had been fleeing. But as he drew closer to the fire, he began to make out details that suggested a different story. The camp was small and neat, with military-style organization and equipment. A single figure sat beside the fire, and as McKenna approached, the man looked up without surprise, as if he'd been expecting company. "You're a long way from home, McKenna," the figure said, his voice carrying the distinctive accent of the Texas Hill Country. "And you've brought some interesting company." The McKenna's blood ran cold as he recognized the voice. It belonged to Colonel Marcus Thornton, a career Army officer who had been hunting Apache raiders for the past 5 years. Thornton was known throughout the territory as a skilled tracker and a ruthless fighter, but he was also a man of honor who followed the rules of warfare even when fighting an unconventional enemy. "Colonel Thornton," McKenna said, keeping his pistol drawn but not pointing it directly at the officer. "I didn't expect to find you here." Thornton was a man in his early 50s, with graying hair and the weathered features of someone who had spent most of his adult life in the field. He wore civilian clothes rather than his uniform, and his equipment was minimal, suggesting that he was on some kind of reconnaissance mission rather than leading a military patrol. "I've been tracking the same group of slave traders that you seem to be running from," Thornton said, his tone conversational despite the tension of the situation. "Rodriguez and his men have been operating in this area for months, and I've been trying to gather evidence of their activities. This unexpected revelation changed everything. If Thornton was pursuing Rodriguez rather than the Apache, then perhaps they had found an ally rather than another enemy. But McKenna knew better than to trust appearances, especially when dealing with a man of Thornton's reputation and experience. "And what do you intend to do about the Apache girl?" McKenna asked, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Thornton's eyes narrowed as he studied McKenna's face in the firelight. "That depends on how she came to be in your company," he said. "If she's your property, then that's a matter between you and whatever passes for law in this territory. If she's a captive, then I have a duty to ensure her safety." It was a careful answer, one that revealed nothing about Thornton's true intentions while putting the burden of explanation on McKenna. The rancher realized that he was going to have to make a choice about how much to reveal to the army officer. "She's not my property," McKenna said finally. "I bought her freedom from a trader, and I'm trying to get her to safety before Rodriguez and his men catch up to us." Thornton's expression didn't change, but McKenna could see the gears turning behind his eyes. The colonel was processing this information, weighing it against what he knew about McKenna's character and the situation in the territory. "That's an expensive gesture," Thornton observed. "What's your interest in one Apache girl?" It was the question that McKenna had been dreading, the one that would force him to reveal more about his motivations than he was comfortable sharing. But he could see no way around it now. If he wanted Thornton's help, or even his neutrality, he would have to be honest about his reasons. "3 years ago," McKenna said, his voice barely above a whisper, "Rodriguez's men took my wife. She was part Apache, and they sold her to a brothel in Mexico. By the time I found her, she was already dead." The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Thornton's expression softened slightly, and for the first time since the conversation began, McKenna saw something resembling sympathy in the colonel's eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss," Thornton said quietly. "That explains a great deal about your current situation." Behind them, hidden in the shadows of the cottonwood trees, Ayana had been listening to this conversation with growing understanding. McKenna's actions now made sense to her, and she felt a surge of empathy for the pain that had driven him to spend his life savings to purchase the freedom of a stranger. But their moment of understanding was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats echoing through the narrow canyon entrance. Rodriguez had found them, and there was nowhere left to run.